Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
Help me welcome His Excellency David Comissiong, Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM. Always great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tisha. It's a pleasure to be here.
And this morning also joining us is Dr. June Soomer, who is Chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, of course, the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is one of the newest UN agencies, and its purpose is to focus on the needs and interests of Africans and people of African ancestry. This is something that you've talked about. We heard much talk about it within the confines of the UN and the meetings about getting past a set amount of time and then moving toward adding time so that the work could continue. So set the table for us, Ambassador, in terms of what segue we've been able to make, or what inroads we've been able to make, rather, and what you think the next decade should usher in.
Well, it's interesting that you began the program with a message from the Secretary General of the UN about human rights, because this, one of the newest UN agencies, is focused specifically on the human rights of Africans and people of African descent. And we're on conversations on CARICOM, so I need to let you know that this new agency, which comprises 10 members drawn from all over the world, representatives from all over the world, has a very, very significant CARICOM presence, because no less than 2 of the 10 members, so 20% of the seats on the permanent forum, are from CARICOM. And we also have the distinction of having one of our CARICOM sisters, Dr. June Soomer, from St. Lucia, as the president or chair of the UN Permanent Forum. And June is a real CARICOM person, I'm sure, when she introduces herself, but she was St. Lucia's ambassador to CARICOM. She served as the first female Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, very much a brainchild of CARICOM. So we are very proud that this very important UN agency that is focusing on the rights of African people, that we have CARICOM president. And we also have Gaynell Curry from the Bahamas. Gaynell was supposed to be with us today, but her flight got into Barbados very, very late last night. But there in Barbados, the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, all 10 of them, plus their support staff, there in Barbados this week to have some internal meetings, but also to have engagements with human rights and activists from right across the Caribbean who are coming into Barbados, to have that engagement with them on Thursday. And they'll also be engaging with the Barbados government officials on Friday. So I can't even remember the question you asked me.
I think you answered it
but
adequately.
Yes,
so.
but I want to set the stage for your engagement with Dr. Soomer in her capacity as, I prefer to say president. I'm not sure if it's chair or president of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, but yes, Dr. June Soomer.
All right, what an introduction. I don't think we could have asked for anything more, but it's wonderful for us to understand the scope, the full scope of your commitment to everything that this forum needs to kind of undertake and accomplish under your watch and then beyond. So let's start at the beginning. What's the mandate really? What's the overarching aim of having this forum, and most certainly of extended the period that we are recognizing that people of African descent need to take center stage in a big way?
Well, thank you very much again for your warm welcome. It's good to be in Barbados, and let me start at the beginning by saying thank you to the government of Barbados for hosting the Permanent Forum this week. It is because of the hard work that many people in Barbados have put in that we are able to accomplish this. The Permanent Forum was established to ensure that people of African descent enjoy all the full human rights afforded to all peoples. So we concentrate on the issues related to the first decade, whether they be issues related to recognition, justice, or development. And these three pillars have ensured that our mandates, whether we look at issues related to reparatory justice, sustainable development, engagement with civil society, which is a big part of our mandate, so that we could articulate a declaration on people of African descent. You find that people of African descent always have to prove annually our humanity. And this forum ensures that we get into these spaces where we could advise on the progress that we are making. So, as you said, one of our mandates was to monitor the first decade, which is ending this month. The first decade we felt had many gaps. Many countries did not recognize the decade. Many countries did not put in, even in the Caribbean, we didn't put in the work that was necessary to make or to make progress as people of African descent and as African people. And so we have called for a second decade because of the gaps that we recognize. There are some things that were very important that didn't find a place in the first decade. One of them, of course, being climate justice. We didn't find a place either for artificial intelligence and digital justice, which is something that is making us even more invisible as people of African descent. And so we want a new decade, not just a technical rollover, which is what everybody wants to avoid any serious discussion with regard to what was accomplished. And then they ask us why we want a second decade. But the things that were supposed to be put in place with regard to removal of systemic racism remain, untouched. And so we want a second decade to deal with that and to make sure that there is a mechanism, because many of these decades or issues are declared and there's no mechanism for monitoring and evaluating. So we want to be able to do that as a forum. So essentially, that is why we want a second decade.
Absolutely. Now, Ambassador Dr. Soomer mentioned that during the first decade, we didn't necessarily get the full buy-in, more or less, across the region that we needed. As Ambassador, do you see now that as we approach the second decade, that there's far more interest or commitment from our leaders to getting more done for people of African descent?
Well, first of all, just listening to Dr. Soomer, you will see why we in CARICOM selected her to be one of our two candidates to contest for places on the permanent forum, because of that same kind of no-nonsense attitude about not going through the motions, but insisting on concrete results. And let me say that this United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is actually one of the fruits of the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. Just to give you the background, this whole process really has its roots in the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism. Out of that came a whole set of initiatives, a group of experts on people of African descent, International Year of People of African Descent, ultimately the International Decade on People of African Descent. And then out of the International Decade came the establishment of this new forum. And we selected Dr. Soomer to contest, to be a candidate put up before the UN General Assembly, to be elected to one of the 5 seats allocated, selected by the General Assembly. And Ms. Curry, we put up Ms. Curry to be a candidate for one of the 5 seats selected by the United Nations Human Rights Council. So that's just the background. Now, June is quite right. The first decade, which ran from 2014 to ends this year, 2024, did not achieve what it should have achieved. And I think one of the reasons it did not achieve what it should have achieved is because we only got the UN Permanent Forum towards the very end of the decade. What was lacking was that body that could have, been there overseeing the decade, advocating, calling attention to the relevant parties about progress or lack thereof, and that would have been the UN Permanent Forum. So there's a call now for a second decade to begin at the beginning of 2025. The Permanent Forum has called for the second decade. CARICOM is also supporting the call for the second decade. And we are confident that if we can get the second decade, that the very presence and activities and advocacy of the Permanent Forum will be a decisive factor in making the second a difference, a significant difference with the second decade. So yes, the agenda for African people is far from complete. As you would have heard from June, there's still many, many issues to be accomplished. And there's absolutely a need for a second decade.
Dr. Soomer has a lot to say, and she shared a lot on her views. Now, as head of the forum that has been established, I'm sure she has lots of work to do, but she's up to the time. She's ready to do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am both honored and privileged to serve you as chair of the Permanent Forum over the next year. I take over from a formidable chair, Dr. Epsie Campbell-Barr, and will work to consolidate and build on the work already started. I think that we should give Dr. Barr another round of applause. Thank you very much. I also take the opportunity to thank the members of the Permanent Forum, the dedicated members of the Permanent Forum, the hard-working members of the Permanent Forum, for giving me their support and confidence in appointing me as the chairperson. I am also honored for the support of the member states and civil society, especially civil society. We have more than 1,500 people who have registered for this conference. I thank you very much. I thank you for the momentum this will build, and it will ensure that we fulfill the mandates of the DDPA. The DDPA that we are asked to keep quiet about, I want you to make noise for it. As a woman of African descent from a small island developing state, St. Lucia, a member of CARICOM and the OECS, my advocacy on reparations and sustainable development, and also on climate justice, will be relentless.
Dr. Soomer's presentation. Of course, wonderful to have you here on set, but great to hear your address, your interim address in that space.
Thank you very much. I think the important thing for me during that address was the awareness of the kind of partnerships that we are starting to build. I said we had more than 1,500 people register for the conference. We had 87 side events that different groups organized. We are fast becoming the biggest mechanism for people of African descent. And we give them voice and we give them agency. And that's very important. And that is why we're in Barbados this week. because we are supposed to articulate with other anti-racism mechanisms declaration on people of African descent, but we cannot do that without the voices of people of African descent. The 10 experts cannot just sit down and do a declaration. So we are undertaking to do consultations in all of the regions, and the Caribbean is the first. For me, as the chair from CARICOM, the Caribbean had to be the first, which is why we are meeting in Barbados this week. And so we are meeting with civil society groups that are stakeholders in the whole discussion on people of African descent. And I think that coming out of the Caribbean, because we are world leaders, whether we accept it or not, we are the ones who really revived the whole reparatory justice movement that is now a global movement. And so our voices this week will be important with regard to how we articulate that declaration. And then we move on to the other regions. So as the chair, I'm very happy that we are getting this support here in Barbados, and we are going to be meeting with the civil society groups on Thursday to have that one-day consultation. And we'll also be meeting with other civil society groups in Barbados, especially the task force on reparatory justice, for us to have more intricate decision making, because we are not making these decisions on our own. We like the partnerships that we are building.
Absolutely. And for the first time, Ambassador, we've seen reparatory justice take center stage and kind of take on a different look and feel. For a long time, there were many people who weren't willing to get on board for whatever reason. Maybe they felt as though it was something that it really wasn't meant to be. But I feel like we've been able to maybe change that conversation to the extent that a lot more people are on board with it. That, along with economic empowerment, are two things that have really taken center stage, I think, within the context of this conversation. And I'm sure it will be high on the agenda, as Dr. Soomer mentioned. How do we kind of prioritize all of these major things that she has mentioned? So we talk about recognition, justice, development, climate justice, AI and digital justice. There's a lot to get through, and even though we're working toward another decade, how do we prioritize, or what do we prioritize to ensure that we truly make inroads during this second decade we're calling for?
You know, the reality, Tisha, is that this monumental crime against a particular segment of the human family was committed some 500 years ago. It was institutionalized. It was built into almost every facet of human life: economics, education, healthcare, you name it, philosophy. And we have been fighting against this now for hundreds of years. We have been fighting to remove that monumental injustice and to restructure domestic societies, but also the international economic and political order. So if you just look at any of the texts of whether it's the UN Permanent Forum or the group of experts on people of African descent, you will see that they are touching upon virtually everything. And they have to touch upon virtually everything because the truth is, in virtually every sphere of human life, Black people are still disadvantaged, still discriminated against. You name it: education, healthcare, trade, economic processes. Of course, the good thing is that we have made progress over the years. One of the things that the UN Permanent Forum is doing now is putting together a new declaration on the rights of people of African descent. Now, over 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, the Marcus Garvey organization, gathering in New York City in August of 1920, thousands of African people from all over the world, they put together the first declaration of the rights of the Negro people of the world. And if you read that document, you will see, again, that document deals with everything. There was education, health, migration, you name it. But if you read that document, you will see that our ancestors, just 100 years ago, they were dealing with lynching. They were dealing with forced labor in Africa. They were dealing with the total theft of the African continent. So they were dealing with a tremendously oppressive situation for Africans and people of African descent. Fortunately, we have made some progress over the last 100 years. So June's Permanent Forum is not quite dealing with lynching. It's not quite dealing with an African continent that is totally under imperialist control. We have made some progress, but the challenges still remain in virtually every area. I think one of the strengths of the reparations issue is that the reparation issue really helps us to cover so many other areas. Because even as we demand reparatory justice, repair, we demand that those legacies of underdevelopment of African people that have their roots in those centuries of European-imposed African enslavement, native genocide, and so forth, that those legacies of underdevelopment be addressed and be repaired. When we focus on that and we do that, we are going to find that we are also addressing disparities in a whole range of different sectors. But to answer your question, it is difficult to just say you're going to prioritize this over, this thing or that thing, because the discrimination, the inequities, the inequalities are still so wide-ranging. Hence, the need for a decade and the need for a specialized agency like the Forum to keep the world focused on this multifaceted agenda.
And it's wonderful that the Caribbean has a voice on that forum. Finally, from you, Dr. Soomer, what are your hopes coming out of the meetings here in Barbados this week for your work on the forum?
Well, we are a very young forum, and because we were thrown into the work, we have not had a chance to develop a strategic plan, and that's where your issue of priorities come in. So the first 2 days of our in-house consultation, we will be doing a strategic plan. So we are hoping to emerge with that plan that would help us engage more focused, in a more focused way, with partners, with funding agencies, because the Permanent Forum is not funded. The decade, unfortunately, in many ways was not funded, and that is one of the weaknesses of the decade. We are hoping there will be a funded second decade. We are hoping also to bring more focus to women of African descent. A day was declared with regard to women of African descent, because when we look at the statistics, and we are supposed to look at the statistics as a forum, we are finding that women of African descent are the most disadvantaged people in the world. The health care, for example, the health statistics, the maternal health statistics are the lowest in the world. And so we are trying to have that comprehensive discussion that would ensure that women of African descent have that place that we want. So we are hoping to engage more deeply also with the Caribbean people, to bring awareness, to also ensure that CARICOM's face is recognized in the next decade, in the forum, amongst people in the Caribbean, because one of my biggest disappointments at the forum, we had more than 1,000 people, or close to 2,000 people descend on Geneva, and maybe 10 of them were from the Caribbean. Our governments have to invest in making sure that our young people especially understand what is happening and where we are going, because we may be looking back, but we are looking forward. And looking forward means that whatever we do must ensure that we build generational wealth. And if the young people are not there with us as we move along, because many of them don't understand what we're doing, we will fall further behind. So that is my message to the governments here in Barbados and to other governments in CARICOM. CARICOM youth must be involved in all of these advocacy groups, and we must be able to give the advice that is necessary.
All right, we certainly look forward to all that will come from the meetings this week. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. June Soomer, for coming in and sharing
Thank
with
you.
us. I know it's early, particularly when you're traveling. It can be a little difficult to get out this early and still be able to work throughout the day. So best wishes to you on moving forward in this position. And we look forward to lots happening during this second decade. Thank you both.
Thank you
Tisha.
very much.
Thank
Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.